Hello and welcome to another in our series of interviews looking at responses to the COVID outbreak, particularly from government, but we're also interested in the way in which companies and civil society and voluntary organisations are responding. We'll be covering some of those in future interviews. Today I'm joined by Tom Levitt, who's a former MP and author of a very interesting book in 2018 called The Company Citizen, about which the then CEO of Unilever said, "Never has the case for business to step up and help solve society's challenges been greater, and rarely has it been better put than in this excellent account." And certainly the first part of that is even more relevant now in terms of solving society's challenges in the context of the present crisis. So welcome, Tom. Is there anything you wanted to add about that? And one of the things I wanted you to do was just to explain for people watching this what you mean by company citizens.
Well, in terms of what you've just said, I defer to Paul Pullman's judgment entirely. And no, I was very proud of that quote from Paul, who at Unilever did some tremendous things. And you can see that Unilever just last week contributed, I think it was $100 million, $50 million of which, half of which is specifically to step up their campaign to promote hand washing throughout the third world. Okay, it uses Lifebuoy soap, but the whole point of that campaign is to reduce waterborne diseases, and of course will help with coronavirus as well. So yes, I prefer the term company citizen to CSR or some of the other names, attributes that are flying around, because I think everyone understands what a citizen is. And a citizen is a blend of rights and responsibilities. That's what citizenship is all about. And too often, I think we see companies in terms of wanting to get what they can, their rights as it were, and with less emphasis on the responsibility. But there has to be a balance with companies as there does with individuals. I also did some work a few years ago on SMEs, and they didn't recognize the phrase corporate social responsibility. They said, we're not corporates, it doesn't apply to us. And so therefore, a word had to be found, a phrase had to be found, which would convey that question, that issue of the responsibilities of businesses to the society in which they live. Companies, after all, are social organisations. They're groups of people coming together, and therefore shouldn't be exempt from what we'd expect in terms of standards from citizens.
No, I agree. And I think it's very interesting that companies as we know them today, in terms of joint stock limited liability companies, are actually fairly new phenomenon. I mean, they only emerged in the middle of the 19th century, and they emerged because governments, like the British government was one of the first, legislated to allow them to exist because they couldn't exist under previous law. And the reason people forget, the reason we refer to them as public corporations in the UK is because they exist in public law. And we give them all sorts of citizenship rights as if they were citizens. But the other side of the bargain, the citizen responsibilities, sometimes gets a bit ignored. So I wonder if we could go on to just talking about how you see company citizens in the context of the current crisis and what's been going well and what's been going badly in terms of corporate responses.
I'd like to preface that by saying that there are different brands of company citizens, and I think that the ones who are able to discharge those responsibilities best, generally speaking, are those which think more long-term than others. If they're companies which are dedicated to maintaining their quarterly share price as their first priority, if they're effectively therefore shareholder economies rather than stakeholder economies, then they're not going to be able to discharge company citizenship duties in the same way. There is evidence which London Business School has produced, which shows that companies which think long term and which therefore put sustainability issues higher up their agenda are actually more profitable over a 10-year period than those who are dedicated to short-term profits. and we've already mentioned Unilever once, but when they scrapped quarterly reporting, the people who walked away from investing in Unilever were the hedge funds. And that was part of the purpose of doing that. And taking the hedge funds away with their very, very short-termist approach led to a more stable share price and therefore a better ability to plan for the future and invest. So companies which already have a good start on the company citizenship stakes, I believe will have responded better to the current crisis than others. We saw the hotel in Scotland that sacked everybody and threw them out on the street, but was forced by public opinion to bring them back. We've seen banks even deciding to delay their dividend payments and until they can see how this thing pans out. So they are deprioritizing the traditional shareholder superiority, if you like, the shareholder preference in terms of the longer term success of the company and indeed of a wider group of stakeholders and not just shareholders. And I think that's excellent. Any move from shareholder economy to stakeholder economy, any move from short-term thinking to long-term thinking will help towards establishing companies as company citizens. But we've also seen, and I'm thinking here of supermarkets, how quickly they can change. And supermarkets in the last couple of weeks have changed their supply chain practices, they've changed their customer-facing practices, and they've done it largely successfully. I won't say they did it perfectly. During the first week, there was some chaos, but it shows how a large and well-managed company can adapt to changing situations really quite quickly. And if they do that with the needs of the customer first, which they are certainly claiming to do in the case of the supermarkets, then that's all well and good. And something may well have been learned out of this sad experience, which we're all suffering at the moment.
That's very interesting. And there have been some much larger cases than the hotel in Scotland of companies, particularly some very large companies that seem to be trying to take advantage of the current situation. The one that springs to my mind is EasyJet, who've simultaneously applied for a 600 million euro loan or pound loan, and has paid out about 150 odd million in dividends, including 60 million to the founder of the company.
It was 174 million in dividends plus 60 million to but on the other hand, you've got the football clubs, Liverpool yesterday, for example, who said they were now not going to take part in the furlough scheme because it does just sound ridiculous for multi-millionaires who run and own those organisations, the millionaires who play on the pitch, then getting the taxpayer to pay the wages of the I don't know, minimum wage, quite possibly members of that particular community. So I would say well done to them. But equally, you got, again, another airline, you got Virgin talking about wanting a bailout when, in order to pay half of the salary for the entire staff out of his own pocket, it would cost Richard Branson less than 1% of his personal wealth. Again, I think that's just this, if I can use the phrase, in this august company.
Absolutely. I wonder if we could just move on to talking about the relationship between corporations and companies and government, because one of the things that's been obvious in the current crisis is a need for a degree of coordination, not just at national level, but at local levels. And it's difficult to know exactly what's going on because things are moving so fast, and obviously some of this is behind closed doors. But I get the impression there's been very uneven levels of cooperation, both at national level and in some local areas. There have been some examples of very good local cooperation and others where it's not worked quite so well. I wondered if you'd been observing that as well.
It's very difficult from one's little flat for the last 2 weeks not to observe very much at all. But I think something perhaps even more fundamental is what we have seen is a need for government. And I think that's a serious point, because there's been an element in our politics for many, many years that basically sees government as an obstacle to business rather than a partner. And we've seen, well, we've seen a Conservative government taking measures which, under other circumstances, one could never have envisaged a Conservative government doing, in terms of the amount of money it's putting into the economy. But if there wasn't a government with a capacity to do that, helped, of course, by a very, very low interest rate, then we would really be being stuck. And I come back to the point that we've seen the supermarkets in particular respond very, very quickly, change very, very quickly. And yet, on the other hand, we're seeing that the Chancellor's proposals from 2 weeks ago, which were very much welcomed at the time, and people are now saying, well, where are they? You know, government has not proved itself able to act with the speed that some in the private sector have done. And that, I think, is a problem almost inherent in government. And it's one of the reasons why I, after 30 years in the voluntary sector, the public sector, and 13 years in government, actually started to look to businesses for being sources of social change, social and environmental change, and change for the good. And it quite surprised me 10, 15 years ago that I actually found it.
It's very interesting. I wonder if we could just turn for the last few minutes to the issue of what the future is going to look like and how you think this crisis is going to affect companies in general and particularly their citizenship role. But I know you've been thinking about some of the longer term implications. I know it's very early to speculate at this stage, but please do.
Well, they can respond in one of three ways: well, badly, or for God's sake, let's get back to normal. And I don't think back to normal is going to happen. One thing which I don't think is ever going to go back to normal is this business of home working. And you know, the number of people who are now thinking, well, you know, I only need to be in the office for 2 or 3 days a week. I don't need to be going in and clogging up the roads or competing for space on the tube every single day. And the technology is there, and it's there at a price now, which it wasn't even 5 years ago, to be able to do so much more in terms of home working. So that's one thing I think which will change. And I think businesses ought to be looking at the current situation in terms of opportunities, as well as clearly in some respects threats. But those opportunities, and the opportunities to behave more like a company citizen, things which were seen as a barrier only 2 or 3 weeks ago, are now seen as a low-cost way of getting onto the front foot on sustainability and responsibility issues. For example, one of the pleas of the small businesses over the years has been to big business, please pay your bills on time. The government has a prompt payment code which was set up in 2012, which they said if it wasn't taken up significantly, then they would consider legislation, but they never have. And there's still only 3,000 companies signed up to the prompt payment code. It basically says companies should pay their bills within 30 days. And that would save so many small businesses in normal circumstances. Today, you know, it would be manna from heaven for small businesses to get paid within 30 days. And yet 60 days, 90 days, even 120 days is now becoming standard amongst big corporates. So look at the prompt payment code. It's also an opportunity to reward the most loyal and hardworking workers who work for a pittance. And I would say that bringing in the living wage for so many companies, companies like Barclays have been doing this for years now, is actually relatively low cost. And it would not only be a really good thing for internal company politics and the working with the people on the shop floor and at ground level, but it actually generates employee engagement, it generates productivity, and it generates a good reputation as well. And it also saves money for the taxpayer, and companies are taxpayers, because clearly benefits are just related to living wage, not 100%, otherwise it wouldn't be worth doing it for the individuals, but they do. And the fair tax mark is something I hope that companies would want to look to. There are only about 50 big companies at the moment, most of them cooperatives, who are accredited as paying fair tax. And this basically says we don't use artificial ways of reducing our tax burden. Companies should be proud, citizens should be proud to be in a position where they can pay tax. And the way we pay tax as individual citizens and as company citizens is to then pay for the services which are better provided that way and which we couldn't provide for ourselves. And we've seen, again, in the last 2 weeks, how much that common wealth of taxpayers' funding is so important, whether it's the NHS or elsewhere. We should be proud of funding the NHS. They should be proud of being corporate taxpayers, high rate taxpayers, whatever. I liked Wayne Rooney's point the other day of why are we getting at footballers for not making a contribution, when many of them actually are, when we don't look, when we all live in the country. What about the tax exiles? I'm sure he had no place in mind.
I'm sure he did. That's been really great. Thank you very much, Tom. And I hope you keep safe and well in all of this, and don't get too stir crazy, locked up in your apartment.
Well, I think you've been locked up a little longer than I have, and you've clearly not gone stir crazy yet, Colin.
No, I can get out to walk the dog occasionally, which is fine. Okay, thank you very much for joining us.